Welcome to the More in Common podcast. We all know how hard it can be to handle conflict and disagreements, especially when it comes to politics. These moments can strain even our closest relationships, and that's why we're here. I'm Keith Richardson, and for over 5 years, we at More in Common have worked with professionals from all walks of life, NFL teams, tech companies, and community leaders, ultimately to improve how people connect and communicate. And with my background in psychology, I've spent 20 years refining strategies that focus on compassion and understanding. And I'm joined by my co-host, Gerren, who joined the team 2 years ago. Gerren is a producer, an entrepreneur, and a creative, and he lives the principles we talk about, bringing real-world experience to every episode. Together, we're here to help you discover how we all have more in common than we might think. Enjoy the show.
Let's go. Huh?
Hey, welcome back. It's good to see you. It's good to be here.
Give me a hey. Give me a hey. Welcome back.
Give me hey. Welcome back to the More in Common podcast, right?
Yeah,
Welcome
no,
back.
because
Good to have the audience
honestly,
back.
Keith, we've been at this for a few weeks now. People are giving us some feedback. People are sharing and liking, which I appreciate. Keep doing that.
It's good. A lot of the sharing is me sharing.
It's a lot of you, but it's also there's some friends and not my mom.
Yeah, no, there's been some
mom.
good
If you
stuff
hear
that-
this, I want to see some shares.
We're still an amateur podcast that's trying to find their audience. Yeah, sure.
Hey, you speak for yourself, there, fella.
I'm a pro. No one's paying me yet.
But in saying that, in realizing that we're starting to reach people and have some good conversations, I realize there's a lot of peers and friends right now who are they need a little extra boost, right? They need a little a reminder of the goodness of the world in itself, but also that they're kind of a key factor in making that good happen, right? Like that they need to be reminded of the power of positive self-thought, positive self-talk, and being optimistic in the face of some of the more stiffer things that happen in life. So that's what I want to talk about this week. I want to break down with you some of the pitfalls of optimism and pessimism, because both sides of the coin.
Both sides of the same coin, that's for sure.
But also talk about how we maintain our optimism in the face of some of the more, like I said, tougher things that occur in our daily lives, man. So let's talk about it. Let's get into it.
Yeah, it's interesting, specifically relative to the mission of what we're trying to accomplish in driving more connection through productive conversation, right? It's very hard sometimes, and you hear it a lot in conversation. What's the point? Why should I have a conversation? I'm not going to change their mind. Look at that group of people. I could talk about in-group, out-group biases right there, right? There's no point. Nothing is going to change. You did a few weeks ago, the drip, right? Like that drip effect of having little conversations over time that affect outcomes in a positive way. And it does. It plays a huge role in our perspective, in how we perceive the possibilities of outcomes affects how we act. It affects whether or not we pursue a job. It affects whether or not we delegate responsibilities. It affects whether or not we engage in a conversation, or we go to a party, or we ask somebody out. And I'll just start by saying, like, this journey for me has been real. I would have called myself a realist for the longest time, when in reality I was a pessimist, until one day I was introduced to the concept of really defining what this is and then how you can train it and change it. And that was, I think that was 9 years ago for me, and it changed.
Now let's dig in a little bit
literally
on
changed
that,
my life.
because I think that is an important factor. These are things like optimism, pessimism. They're words that people think that they know, but it reminds me of what we often talk about in Mike workshops of suitcase terms.
Marvin Minsky.
Yeah. Explain the concept so that the folks kind of are up to speed.
Yeah, a suitcase term. We hear these a lot because of politics. Terms that we all pack our own meaning into. So in essence, when we approach a conversation, or you're listening to a podcast, or you're watching the news and these things get said, the person that says it means something different than what you're interpreting it as, because you pack your own baggage and understanding and all of those other things, and it makes you maybe less likely to engage with that content. It makes you think that you're on the same page, even though you're actually talking about two very different things. It's termed a suitcase term. The meaning of these terms, and then raise the definition so that when we're having a conversation, we move forward with the common understanding of what we're discussing versus the assumption that we're having the same conversation when it turns out we're not.
One of my favorite examples of this right now in society is the phrase, the word woke.
Whoa,
there's so many people using it, so many places, but I'm pretty sure no one actually knows what it's
no one knows. Like, you say woke to one person and you might be on the same page. To another person, you're having a wildly different conversation. As a great example. But yeah, let's unpack optimism and pessimism, right? Because this really comes down to the outlook that we have of possible outcomes. If I'm optimistic, I have a positive outlook on potential outcome. If I'm pessimistic, I have a negative outlook on potential outcome. And that's really the baseline of these terms. Now, you sprinkle in this idea of realism that we all like to say, I'm just realistic. When in reality, your realism is just based on the information that you have that's giving you a perspective of future outcome. So it's shrouded in pessimism or it's shrouded in optimism. I can be realistically optimistic and realistically pessimistic.
Although I feel like when people use that term in conversation, they're leaning toward the pessimism more often than
100%. And I can say, I can attest to that from life experience, man.
Yeah.
Like, most of I'm just a realist. It's like, so it's not going to work out. Okay.
This
so
is what you're saying,
really,
basically, that you don't think this is going to work.
Right. Therefore, you are a pessimist, right? And there's interesting research, and I won't dive too deep into the research because it hasn't been overly peer reviewed, but it's some interesting studies that look to actually break this down. Like, these terms really speak to the English language's our limit, the vast amount of words that exist to actually describe what we do. We boil it down to the simplest terms so we can navigate conversation and find safety, right? Like, everything we do is for safety. I'm going to say it every episode at least once. And that's what this all comes down to, right? Is our perception of safety for action now based on future outcomes. If I maintain a protective, pessimistic outlook, I might not take a risk, but I am going to stay safe in my space, and I'm going to feel okay with that. It's interesting when you from high performance psychologists like Dr. Mike Gervais, we've referenced him before, like, having an optimistic outlook is allowing you to show up and fail and show up again, right? It's going to work out. Now, we often, in like philosophy, tends to shy away from optimism as a valid perspective because we think of it in terms of, this goes back to suitcase terms, blind optimism. Everything's going to be fine, despite the evidence to the contrary, right? So this research that I'm referring to really tries to break it down into unrealistic optimism, which is what we just discussed, right? Like this, there's nothing about the current circumstance that tells me that is going to happen, right? Like, I am optimistic we can leave the galaxy. Based on what? Right? Now, it might cause you to take huge risks and try new things and put all kinds of advances in technology. Great outcome. Probably still not going to leave the galaxy, right? Not in your lifetime anyway. But maybe your goal is to just leave the galaxy as humanity. But again, it's based on evidence to the contrary that that's even possible. But by having that optimistic outlook causes you to just do things that no one else would, because they're looking at it and going, see, that's not possible. Why even try?
I find this kind of akin to like the wild entrepreneur spirit, right? Like you're almost delusional about what you're trying to go after, but wildly
pursuing
optimistic.
Professional sports is a great example, right? Like, the reality is less than 2% of any sport population is going to go pro, let alone have a sustained Hall of Fame career.
Right.
So if you're I'm going to make it when you can't even make your high school team, that's kind of unrealistic optimism, but it might cause you to work really, really hard. And who knows, maybe you never make pro, but you end up having experiences that lead to a lifetime of doing things that you never would have done otherwise had you not put that effort in, right? So there's value there. Again, it's all based on outcome. Now, going back to the research, now they break it down into rational optimism. And that is the idea that based on data, we can look and say, this is going to work out, right? Because we have the evidence that supports a positive outlook. Then there's perspective optimism. And that's really what we're focusing on, is it's a matter of how I see the world. Generally speaking, I'm looking at the likelihood, hey, outcome is going to be positive, right? Everything's going to be fine. Look, we all have that when we're getting on the road and driving. Like, I'm going to get to my destination. I have an optimistic outlook. If I had a pessimistic outlook that said, if I get on the car, I'm going to crash and end up in the hospital, guess what you're probably not going to do?
Not getting in that car, buddy.
I'm not getting in that car, right?
Right.
So every day we do things with the possibility of a positive outcome. But now it's a matter of, what is our general perspective, right? Are we actually looking and engaging in our world, engaging with the other people, that there is a positive outcome that can result from this? Might not. That's okay. It doesn't mean I'm going to stop. And when we think about conversations, and we talked about it, that group over there, I'm not going to engage with a single individual because of my perceived negative outcome of activity, or of the action of the conversation. But if I think about it and go, yeah, you know what, maybe I think this can turn out well, and then it doesn't, the perspective optimism is to say, it didn't with that person, but that doesn't mean it's not going to with the next. And I'm going to, right? Now, you may over time have 7,000 conversations and not a single one of them leads to a positive outcome. Now we go back into that rational optimism. It's like, yeah, maybe I probably am not going to try.
Perhaps
again.
this is not as realistic as I once thought.
Perhaps my optimism was a little unrealistic. However, going back to the entrepreneur and the space travel, like 7,000 conversations is a small blip on the radar of all the people that exist in the world. And maybe you're just talking to the wrong people. So I'm going to keep trying. I have perspective optimism that what we're doing will make a difference, that it's making a difference. Even if, it's a few people at a time, the small drips eventually are going to lead. There are moments where I actually think, what's the point? And then in those moments, real talk, I'll think, gee, I'm going to give you a call and I think we should shut it down. Right?
Has this happened to you, or what are you revealing stuff on air right now?
I am sharing. I am sharing. Not sharing. I am sharing.
Getting deep there. Yeah, no. And so in these perspectives on optimism, pessimism, we process these things in our brains, yes, consciously or unconsciously, but how do we kind of affect this on a high level, right? Like, how do we try to be more aware of how these things are affecting us?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think the first thing I'll call out, like, there's a cognitive bias that we all have. It's called naive realism. It is this idea that the world is as we perceive it, and anybody else who perceives it differently is influenced by propaganda, they're influenced by political influence, they're influenced by their own biases, right? And that they're really skewed. When in reality, we only process information that our brain can process in a moment, and that you, as a whole different human being, actually sees, hears, smells, tastes information differently than I do, right? So taking that and starting there and recognizing that, okay, I get it. I am afflicted by naive realism, because we all are. That in the world that we live in, there are so many other ways to perceive it. As a result, my engagement in the environment is thus to gain new ways of thinking, new processes, new ideas, so I can bolster my own safety, so I can be more adaptable. If you maintain a pessimistic outlook, and nothing is going to work out, so I'm going to stay with how I see the world, you become less adaptable, less flexible. So as the world changes, it's really difficult to change with it.
That's very interesting, because it comes back to our brains just always indexing on safety, essentially, right? Like, whether or not it's what you perceive as the safety of the positive outcome, or like, I'm going to put myself out there so that I can receive this positive, or I'm not going to put myself out there to ensure that nothing bad happens, then you are still wired into safety first, right? Like, where does my brain feel most safe?
And then, so when we think about the perspective of optimism, I always like to use driving as an example, is that we are all optimistic. We do have other biases that get in the way, right? Negativity bias that allows us to see the negative above the 100 other positives that occur in our environment. So this happens on the road. You see that one jackass driving 1,000 miles an hour, and you're like, people are bad drivers. When at the same time you're driving down the road and there are 300 other cars that you're passing, that are passing you, that are changing lanes, and we're all doing that. Guess what? The basic thing that we're doing is abiding by this painted on line as a boundary for safety. Like, that painted line stops nothing.
Yeah.
Like, you can drive over it.
Especially with a 3-ton vehicle doing 80 miles an hour. Like,
you can go back and forth, right? A painted line doesn't stop you, but it creates a boundary of safety so that we all know the rules and we're all working together. So yes, that one person breaks the rules, but the rest of us are doing something actually quite amazing. And that is like the baseline for the possibility of having an optimistic outlook on other things. Like, we are capable of doing this. Like, let's keep thinking we're capable of doing more stuff, as basic as having differing points of view and challenging each other to think broader about things, right? Whether that's a thing at work, whether that's politics, whether that's a thing in your household, right? So now let's go into an actual thing that you can do to train it. Now, I learned this back, like I refer to Dr. Mike Gervais a lot, okay? Because he changed my life when I got to go through a training of his, and he introduced me to this program. So I tell everybody about it as much as possible because it literally was life-changing for me.
That's awesome.
And it's called 3 Amazing Things. And 3 Amazing Things is really, and there's been, like, he refers to the research that's been done and the researchers that do it. I didn't take note of it. I don't exactly know who those people are, but they do it with couples, they do it with individuals, and it's a 30-day exercise. That's it, 30-day exercise. I challenge everybody to try this. Over those 30 days, every day, you write down 3 amazing things. Now, in the spirit of honesty and in life, amazing things that cause awe, which is an emotional experience, like landing on a glacier, which I've done in Alaska. That is an amazing thing. It doesn't happen. So what we're doing now is looking to see the amazing in the things that we see.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went through it, there are 2 things that always stand out to me. Driving on the highway, a merge, busy highway in Chicago, just a perfect zipper. Like I've never seen it since. I hadn't seen it before. I hadn't perceived it before. But it
I
was
don't even believe you. No, I'm just kidding.
I know, right? Most people don't. Like, this isn't a thing. It was the perfect zipper of merging in traffic for the moment that I drove by that on-ramp, that of course.
Right.
Write it down at the end of the day. This is at a time where I didn't have kids. I wasn't married. And, cultural dynamics of dads and kids were something that I thought about. And I saw this dad just holding his kid's hand crossing the street. And I thought that was just an amazing thing in that moment. Write it down, right? You start to see the patterns. All you're looking at now is the patterns of good shit that happens. You're building the evidence for realistic optimism because it's like, oh, good shit actually happens versus constantly looking at that one bad driver and thinking everybody's a bad driver. Right? Go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm just saying another example that keeps sticking out to me right now is airplane flight, right?
Oh, yeah.
Most of the time you don't think about it, but right now everybody's like, well, but you have to have a certain level of optimism to get into a steel tube that flies in the air at 30,000 feet.
You do. You absolutely do. Like, even when it seems like every airplane is crashing, even though statistically it's not. It
Statistically, it's not. But
yeah, I mean, Murphy's Law. Yeah,
right.
It's just shit's going wrong. It's all going wrong. So you do this for 30 days. Every day you write 3 amazing things, and again, not like awe-inspiring, but things that you see as amazing.
Right.
Rodney talks about the hummingbird that he saw outside his window just for like a half an hour and how he just watched it. Like normally you see a hummingbird and you're just like, it's a bird, right? But like to just sit and index and process what's actually happening. Over 30 days, the research that was presented to us and in my anecdotal data, we are literally changing the way we see the world. And in that, our perspective changes on what possible outcomes will happen. Right? What the possible outcome is now positive. So I'm going to engage with you. Let's bring it back to this conversation in a conversation, because you know what? I do believe that there can be a positive outcome. Maybe not, but that's okay. It's not the negative evidence that destroys all things going forward, like a pessimistic outlook would have. The negative thing just simply a roadblock in the movement forward because your perspective is just different. It's not blind optimism. It's not unrealistic optimism. It's simply a perspective that things are going to turn out okay.
I like that a lot. And then I think that the other part of that exercise, which is really amazing, is the ability to slow down a little bit and perceive the world and the amazing things that happen in it, right? Because if you really look at all of the different elements and magic that comes together in order to make the reality as we experience it, it is kind of awe-inspiring. At least it definitely can be.
It can be,
But there's also
especially
a thing,
if you choose to see it.
right? That's the thing. If you choose to see it, and this was where I was going to go next, because listen, we all have rough days, tough times. There's a myriad of things that can happen to you to take you out of that focus. But there's something that you guys talk about also in workshops when we're in person that I really like. And I want you to teach the people, the listeners, about the birthday cake analogy.
Look, this is one of my favorite things because like this goes into training the assumptions and all these other things. But again, it's training how we see the world. When someone cuts you off, the first thing we think, like everybody who's listening to this can probably relate. What an asshole. You have no idea who this person is. And how many times have you cut someone off and been like, oh, shoot, yikes. I made a mistake there, right? I'm not an asshole, right? I made a mistake. But when someone cuts you off, there's a weird perception when we're on the road that we're actually not perceiving people. We're perceiving cars, right? So we're actually judging the car and we're anthropomorphizing it. So we're creating personal characteristics because there's a driver behind it, but really we're assessing the car, right? And so depending on the car that cuts you off and what you assume is driving it and all of these other things. Take all of that aside. We instantly make all kinds of characterizations. That driver, we get angry, we get triggered, we get irritated. So what happens, and we've talked about this, when we're angry, triggered, or irritated is we no longer think rationally. We go into a reactive state and we're not actually processing the world in the most. So we get that anger, then we get home and we're like, oh, I didn't need to be so angry about that, right? So rather than waiting till you get home, possibly going into a road rage fit, it's a change of perspective to think maybe they have like, that $200 birthday cake that you bought for your kid that's in the back seat. And if that thing spills over, it's destroyed, right? And that destroys the birthday. So you're driving really, really careful because you don't want that birthday cake to break. So it's not to tell that story every time, but it's simply to remind yourself that happens, birthday cake. So what you're doing in that moment is just telling yourself, I don't know why this person did this. Optimistically, they're not thinking about me. They didn't do it to spite me, slight me, create a negative environment for me. They're not fighting me. They're not angry. And it's just a reminder, maybe they did what they did because of their own circumstance. Right. In this case, that circumstance is to unwind the anger, fear, frustration, pessimism that you're feeding in that moment to feed more optimism so that you as an individual can go through life more positively for your own experience, for your own physical health, your own mental health, your own emotional health.
Yeah.
Like optimism drives positive outcomes in all those areas, right? So the birthday cake is just a reminder. And you can use it anywhere. Obviously, the example is on the road. And it's the easiest place to do it because you're never going to get feedback from the other person.
I realized the other day that there's a very specific Mexican equivalent to the birthday cake analogy.
Oh,
Es que trae el pozole. So when you're having a big family gathering, sometimes there's a big soup called pozole. and somebody's got to get it to the place where the party is, and so it's like a 40-gallon pot in the backseat of your car.
Spills.
You don't want it to spill, so you have to drive slowly and carefully.
Yeah.
So that's a nice overlap for some cultural connection there. So just think, hey, he's got the pozole. That's why he's driving.
So just think, do your 30 days and think birthday cake along the way, right? And do it every time. And I will tell you, as a client of mine once said, he's like, I took a red eye home. I was tired. I was jet lagged. It was 2, 3 in the morning, and some jerk on the highway got in front of me, and I tried birthday cake, and I said, screw this. Because, not in a place to do it in that moment. That's cool, right? That's okay. But the more you do it, the more I hear it from so many clients that I heard it from a friend, a teammate of mine in baseball, said it to me like a week. He's like, when I first introduced it, he was laughing about it. And then a year later, he tries it and he texts me. He's like, it didn't work. And then he says to me, it finally is starting to register. So you just got to keep trying.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And there are reasons
all
for
these
it,
things.
right? But go ahead.
One of the things that we remind people with all these things that we talk about is it takes practice. Meet yourself where you're at.
Patience.
You got to be willing to go for it, willing to try it. But I do think that, keeping perspective, keeping optimism, and offering yourself grace to other people can help maintain a positive mentality that will get you through some of the rougher spots.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break. And I want to close this up with a little bit of application, and then we'll wrap the show.
Let's do it. We'll be right back after this.
Baja Fun Book is date night made easy. Pick your deal, show your email, and you're in. Dinner, drinks, magic, done. Explore now.
This is the More in Common podcast. I'm Gerren Taylor. That's Keith Richardson.
There it is.
Yeah, I worked it in. You're damn right I did. And we are talking about the functionality of optimism, especially realistic optimism, and how these tools that our brain has affect us in the world. So we were talking a little bit about kind of how to take ourselves out of pessimistic mind states with, noticing the amazingness in the world and the 30-day challenge and the birthday cake analogy. But let's talk about some other applications, right? Like life happens. At the end of the day, this is about how we're going to process and work and engage with life and with others, right? Let's talk about environment. Like I had this example this morning with my kids. My wife's out of town, trying to get the kids ready for school. It was a rough night last night. So, it was a rough morning. It's trash day. It's recycle day. I got to get all that stuff. They got to get ready for school. They're not exactly moving fast. They're 8 and 6 for perspective. And I was just like, I got to get the trash and recycling out. Like, it's got to happen. And so my kids have given me evidence that they're more than capable of getting themselves ready. They've also given me plenty of evidence that tells me that I need to micromanage them or else it's not going to get done and we're going to miss the bus. But this morning, I didn't have the luxury of the negative evidence. I had to rely on the positive evidence. And I was like, I'm taking the trash out. You guys have a few more things to do. By the time I'm back in, need you to be ready to go. And I'm walking down the driveway. I'm like, man, this is a really real test of my optimism for the outcome of this possibility that my kids are going to be ready to go by the time I get all this trash out and do all this stuff. But I have to. The alternative, stay inside. I don't get this done. And I have no other time during the day to get it out before the trash is going to come. And I'm micromanaging them. So I'm stressed, I'm angry, I'm irritated, and I'm behind, and I'm not able to get this stuff done, which also has a domino effect because now it's another 2 weeks before recycling. And I'm not going to be able to get it out until then. So I got to make a choice.
And I chose optimism, like intentionally chose, I'm going to do this because I know my kids will be ready, even though I wasn't quite sure. And by the time I came back, they were ready for school. They were ready for the bus, right? But I could have, like, that's just an example of, that's how it worked out. But the reality of how this plays out in everyday life, and then you play it off into work. And now we're talking about micromanagement. Why do we micromanage? It's trust. We are socialized to say, if you want it done right, do it yourself, right? And there's a lot to unpack there. We're not going to unpack it today, but we don't delegate. Why don't we delegate? Because we look at the negative evidence versus all of the positive evidence to then give to a person and think they're not going to get it done. So we micromanage versus, hey, here's my deadline. I know you're capable of it. I know the evidence that you're capable of it. Sure, you failed once or twice, but I'm not going to rely on that failure. I'm going to rely on the optimistic outlook because I have a job to do. I don't want to be stressed. I don't want to push you. I don't want you to be unhappy. I don't want you to leave this job, right? Like all of the negative things that come from that ecosystem. Trust in other people, and thus increasing the positive expectations that we have of others. Going back to driving, like we're all pretty awesome on the road together overall, right? Like we're training our perspective of others to make things happen. So, this has real world implications to you, to how you parent, to how you lead, to how you just engage with family, and it can be a choice. It absolutely can be a choice, and you can train it.
Yeah, and I think the positives of training for optimism, living with an optimistic perspective, can be, outweighing the negatives of trying to fight every battle like that, right? That's exhausting. Sometimes
it's not very safe. Right? The negative.
No, I mean, I'm one of the people that indexes more on the absolute ridiculous level of optimism. I think I could do anything, and I feel like that has worked for me. So I'm going to keep doing it because I feel like that has been positively reinforced by my life experience.
Well, listen.
And I love having these conversations with you, Keith. I'm so glad that we were able to talk about how optimism and pessimism affect us at these high levels. And again, thank you all for joining us, watching this, listening to this, and sharing, telling your friends about it. I really do hope that, maybe even in 20 years, if YouTube still exists, somebody will stumble across this and be like, I'm just so glad that these boys had this conversation.
I'm just glad it exists. I'm glad it exists. Hey, like it. Like G said, share it. Tell us what you think. Leave comments. And see if we can continue to build the audience.
And you know what? Tell us your stories. I want to hear your stories about crazy optimism or how you faced, feeling pessimistic perhaps in life and turned it around. Perhaps we'll share some stories on the show, and we'll get people more connected.
Love it.
All right, y'all. This is the More in Common podcast. I'm Gerren Taylor. That is Keith Richardson. That guy over there.
I don't know.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week.